Okay, let's continue on about tariffs. A tariff rises the price above the world market price. Thus, the domestic price of textiles will rise above the world price plus the tariff. As the price rises, the domestic quality of the textiles demanded will fall, and the domestic quantity of the textile supplies will rise. The quantity of imports will fall, and the market will move closer to the domestic market equilibrium that occurred even before the trade. So the tariff can help bring it back to the equilibrium. We have to factor in also the welfare before the trade, with trade, and without trade. Another way to restrict trade is the import quotas. An import quota is a limit of quantity of goods that can be produced abroad and sold domestically. Import quotas are very much like tariffs. Both tariffs and quotas raise the domestic price of the good, reduce the welfare of the domestic consumer, but increase the welfare of the domestic producer and cause deadweight losses. However, a tariff raises revenue for the government, where the quota would not. But the quota does create surplus for the license holders. A quota can potentially cause a larger deadweight loss than a tariff, depending on the mechanism used to allocate or import the license. So, what are the lessons that we've learned to benefit trade or not benefit trade? If trade is allowed, the price of textiles will be driven to the world price. If the domestic price is higher than the world price, then the country will become an importer at the domestic price, and the domestic price will eventually fall. If the domestic price is lower than the world price, the country will become an exporter, and the domestic price will rise. If a country's imports produce, domestic producers are made worse off, while the domestic consumers will be made better off. And if the gains of the consumer outweigh the losses of the producers, then the country will be better off being an import. If a country exports a product, domestic producers are made better off, domestic consumers are made worse off, and the gains of the producers outweigh the loss of the consumers. A tariff would create more dead loss because the total surplus would eventually fall. So what are some other benefits of international trade? And in addition to increasing the total surplus, which we know what drives the price, or the profits and revenue, there are several other benefits to trade. These include increased variety of goods and services into our country, exposure, culture, lower costs through economies of scale, increased competition, and an enhanced flow of revenues along with ideas to be able to grow socially, economically, and better welfare in the economies as we go forward. Okay, so now let's talk about some of the arguments for restricting trade. The biggest argument for restricting trade is always and always will be jobs. It's under the assumption that if we import or export, that could cause a loss of jobs. So if a country imports a product, domestics and producers will have to lay off workers because they will decrease domestic output. And when the price declines to the world price, they will not have the demand, so the supply will have to be cut, which is produced by the workers. So, however, free trade will create job opportunities in other industries where countries enjoy comparative advantage. So, it's how we address it and it's how we look at it. Trade can be beneficial to both sides of the partner, but we also must take care of our domestic so that we're able to create other jobs or new jobs if we're specializing in certain products or surplus. And if we're bringing in exports for somebody else or imports where somebody else is specializing, then we need to specialize in something else that would make it better for us to export as well. So in light of the jobs argument, some people argue that taxpayers' subsidies for training programs to help those who lose their jobs due to free trade. We see that all the time when a local municipality or state will give tax breaks to a big industry to get them to relocate in their area. So, we've determined what determines whether a country should import or export goods. That the gains for the winners from interactions from trade exceed those of the losers, and if the gains exceeded so much for the person who wins, are so much greater than the losers, there can be a share in the welfare of those. So we looked at the welfare effects on tariffs and import quotas, the arguments people use to advocate for trade restrictions. We've also looked at the arguments that people use to go against trade restrictions. So just remember, when you look back through this chapter and you're preparing for your test and making notes, we're looking for the effects of free trade that can be determined by comparing domestic price without trade to the world price. A low domestic price indicates that the country has a comparative advantage in producing the good and that the country will become an exporter. A high domestic price indicates that the rest of the world has the better comparative advantage in producing the good and that country will become an importer. So when a country allows trade and becomes an exporter of a good, it producers of the goods are better off and consumers of the good are worse off. When a country allows trade to become an importer of a good, consumers become better off and producers become worse off. In both cases, gains from trade well exceed the losses. Remember, we talked about a tariff is a tax on imports that moves a market closer to the equilibrium that would exist without the trade and therefore reduces the gains from the trade. The equilibrium causes the price points to go back to closer to the equilibrium price, which is what we're trying to develop and make assumptions and predictions. Although the domestic producers are better off and the government raises the revenue, the losses to the consumer will exceed these gains. These are various arguments for restricting trade and protecting jobs, defending national security, helping infant industries, unfair competitions, and the many other ones that we talked about. Also, remember the two organizations we talked about that also help produce or help encourage free trade that works among different countries. Most economists will tell you that they believe that free trade and the ability to specialize and work through the comparative advantage is the best win-win situation that you can have with trade.